It's Friday the 13th, 1980. The original Friday the 13th movie has just been released to theaters, and so has the classic Jack Nicholson horror movie, The Shining. And when young school teacher, wife, and mother Betty Gore is found savagely murdered in her home, the residents of tiny Wiley, Texas have no idea they are about to live their own version of a Hollywood horror movie, courtesy of a killer that none of them saw coming. Hello and welcome to The Dark Side of Love. I am your host, Bianca Sloan, author of suspense novels about the dark side of love. And this week I'm putting a spotlight on part one of the case I'm calling Desperate Housewives. Betty Eileen Pomeroy was born on January 9, 1950, to Bertha and Bob Pomeroy, owners of a service station and much later Bert and Bob's Cafe in Norwich, Kansas. Betty was the only girl and oldest of Bertha and Bob's three children, which includes brothers Ron and Richard. Norwich, an idyllic little town about 45 minutes from Wichita, is farm country all the way, and interestingly enough, named after Norwich, Connecticut. Bertha and Bob raised their brood on the family farm on the west side of town. Petite, dark-haired Betty, described by Texas Monthly as, quote, one of those girls whose conventionality made her the frequent center of attention. She was pretty. She had an innocence about her and a wide Hollywood smile that made her one of the most popular girls in Norwich. Betty was a responsible older sister, cooking and cleaning the house and helping to take care of her younger brothers. But she doesn't let her responsibilities at home get in the way of getting involved with myriad activities at school, everything from choir to student council. After Betty graduates from high school, she attends Southwestern College in Winfield, Kansas, her sights set on becoming an elementary school teacher. And like so many girls of her day, in addition to her bachelor's degree, she would eventually pick up an MRS, that would be a Mrs. degree, when she begins dating her math tutor, Alan Gore. On the surface, Alan did seem like a bit of an odd choice for the pretty, outgoing Betty, with Texas Monthly noting that friends and family, quote, couldn't see what she saw in him. Alan was a small, plain man with horn-rimmed glasses and puffy cheeks, and even at a young age, signs of a receding hairline. He was also shy, which often made him come across as stern or aloof, or even snobbish. However, Betty's brother Ron suggests to People magazine investigates that Betty was able to overlook the superficial, noting, quote, I think Betty saw that he was a smart, intelligent go-getter. Her brother Richard went on to say, quote, you could tell that Alan was destined to go on to bigger and better than any place around here. The couple marry in 1970, about a year after Alan graduates from Southwestern. 3 years later, the Gores welcome their first child, a little girl that they name Alyssa. The Gores are not long for Kansas, as Alan takes a lucrative position with a tech firm in Dallas, which helps to lead the so-called march toward the city and of surrounding suburbs becoming known as the Silicon Prairie. In 1977, Betty and Alan move into the small town of Wiley, Texas. Population approximately 2,600 at that time. Wiley is typical of the burgeoning suburbia of the late 70s, with cookie-cutter homes, well-maintained lawns, and carefree kids playing in the quiet streets. Betty eventually becomes a teacher at Dodd Elementary School, and she and Alan, in search of a place to worship, land at Lucas Methodist Church, described by Texas Monthly as, quote, a drafty white clapboard building known to its congregants simply as the church. And it was at the church where they crossed paths with another young couple like themselves, Pat and Candy Montgomery. Candace Lynn Wheeler was born on November 15, 1949. According to Texas Monthly, Candy, as she was known, was an Army brat who was the daughter of a radar technician and a World War II vet who bounced his family from base to base for 20 years. At some point, Candy landed in Texas, and specifically at Texas Instruments, where she was a secretary. Described by Texas Monthly as, quote, petite and blonde and a little impish with a thin, pointed nose and a contagious, high-pitched laugh, Candy began dating Pat Montgomery, who was considered one of the best electrical engineers at Texas Instruments. Candy and Pat married sometime in the early 70s, and by 1977, when they moved to Wiley, They had two young children and a routine. Pat's $70,000 annual salary was more than enough to allow Candy to be a full time homemaker and mother. While Candy liked and was good at her quote unquote role in the marriage, as Texas Monthly bluntly put it, she was, quote, bored crazy with the drudgery of her life. Betty Gore, for her part, had her own struggles. Over the years, Betty had become increasingly anxious and unsettled by all kinds of things, but her particular Achilles heel seemed to be Alan's excessive work travel. Texas Monthly reported that Betty didn't want to be left alone at all, not even for her husband to take a quick overnight business trip. Alan's travel schedule led to fights, depression, and constant, unrelenting tension between the two. Betty and Candy were, I think, probably more social friends than anything, drawn together through the church, and the fact that their daughters, close in age, were playmates and friends. But Betty and Candy, they were friendly, but certainly not besties. In fact, Betty doesn't really have friends, which is a change from when she was one of the most popular girls in Norwich, Kansas, to being kind of a lonely homebody in Wiley, Texas. Still, Candy, known for being gregarious, hosts a baby shower for Betty, who is pregnant with her second child, and in 1979, baby Bethany joins the Gore family. Friday the 13th, 1980. It is, as they say in Texas, a scorcher, with temperatures expected to reach triple digits. Betty and Alan are planning to take a trip to Europe, just the two of them. And according to Texas Monthly, Betty had been, quote, positively radiant, describing the upcoming trip as a second honeymoon. However, another work trip was a temporary barrier to that so-called second honeymoon, as Alan had to fly to Minneapolis that day. Betty had another breakdown that morning before Alan left, but after a long talk, the couple renewed their focus on the upcoming trip. Alan promised to call from the airport because, as Texas Monthly reported, quote, the sound of his voice would reassure her. Alan arrived at the airport that afternoon and did as he promised, calling home from a payphone, only to get no answer. He tries again a little bit later and same thing. Texas Monthly reported that Alan assumed that his wife was taking her usual afternoon walk with the baby and decided he would try her again later. Alan arrives in Minneapolis without incident, checks into his hotel, and calls Betty again. And again, there is no answer. Now, this is particularly strange because by now it's nighttime, and Betty does not like to go out alone at night. So it's at this point that Alan calls his neighbor Richard Parker, who lives across the street, and asks him to check things out for him. Richard reluctantly agrees. As Texas Monthly reported, Richard had, quote, always thought Gore was a weird guy, quiet and unsociable. He had sold the Gores that house 3 years ago, and he didn't know them much better now than he had then. Alan was one of those guys who always kept his yard so neat. Quiet guys usually had neat yards. Nevertheless, Richard, in his bare feet, runs across the street, bangs on the door, rings the doorbell, and nothing. Runs back to his house, calls Alan at the hotel, and says, nope, nobody is home. Alan decides to call Candy Montgomery because that night, Alan and Betty's daughter Alyssa, she was having a sleepover with Candy's daughter, and he thinks that maybe Candy might have talked to Betty at some point during the day. She tells him that she had been over earlier to pick up a bathing suit for Alyssa and that Betty was fine. She offers to run over to the house and check things out. Alan says, you know what, it's okay. I'm going to have a neighbor go over, and he calls Richard Parker again. What is the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing and expecting a different result. Okay, but at any rate, Richard agrees again to check on things, and this time he sees that the garage door is up and that the lights are on. So somebody must be home now, unlike earlier, but inexplicably, he doesn't ring the doorbell to actually talk to Betty and make sure that everything is okay. Meanwhile, Alan keeps calling the house and there is no answer. He calls the hospital, he calls the police, and nobody by the name of Betty Gore is on any list anywhere. Alan, glutton for punishment, he calls Richard again and he says, look, you go back to the house, break the door down, break a window, whatever you have to do, you get into that house. At this point, Alan, understandably, does not have a whole lot of faith in Richard Parker's abilities, so he calls in the cavalry in the form of two more neighbors, Jerry McMahon, who also works at Texas Instruments, and Lester Gaylor, who is a volunteer firefighter, and he asks them to get over to his house now and find out what the hell is going on And just like he told Richard to get into the house any way they have to. Lester tries the front door, which is more than Richard did, and finds out that it is unlocked. The trio enters the house. The only sound is that of a crying baby. It is baby Bethany, who is covered in her own feces, squalling, red-faced and hoarse from hours of crying because she's been left alone. There is no sign of Betty. As Jim Atkinson, co-author of Evidence of Love, tells People Magazine Investigates, quote, "Something's not right." Richard takes the baby to his house while Lester and Jerry feel their way through the rest of the house, unsure of what to expect, not knowing what they will find. Eventually, they come face to face with the closed door of the utility room. Slowly, Lester opens it, and what they're face to face with is a horror show. There is a pool of blood, and a pool of blood probably doesn't sum it up. It's really an ocean of blood everywhere. It's coating the walls, smeared on the washer and dryer, the freestanding freezer. The first thing they notice is an arm. As Texas Monthly noted, it was, quote, "in a pool of blood and fluid so thick that the arm appeared to be floating above the linoleum." They realize the arm belongs to Betty Gore, and she's dead. Betty Gore is 30 years old. Lester, who remember is a volunteer firefighter, so he's seen some things, says in People Magazine Investigates that nothing prepared him for this, saying, quote, "I've seen a lot of people die in a lot of different ways, but that's the worst I've ever seen." Alan calls the house for an update, and because there is so much blood, it's really hard to tell exactly what has happened. Lester takes a guess that Betty must have been shot, and that's what he tells Alan. Lester then calls the police, who race to the house. Stephen Defebaugh, an investigator with the Collin County Sheriff's Office, comes to the scene. It's after midnight by now, and it's a mob scene of looky-loos and local media. He heads to the utility room to collect evidence and view the body. To his trained eye, it's clear that Betty was not shot to death. That's not the kind of damage that he's looking at. Betty's face, what was left of it, was pulp. She has massive, gaping wounds up and down her body. So no, Betty was not shot to death. It becomes immediately and startlingly clear that Betty was hacked to death with an axe. Defebaugh sees the axe laying on the floor near the body. The handle and the blade are slick with blood. There is a bloody footprint under Betty's thigh, and the size of it is pretty small. So he says, well, this was either a kid, like a teenager, or it was a woman. However, neither of these scenarios makes sense because whoever did this, because of the amount of carnage, the level of savagery, Defebaugh says, you know what, the person who swung this axe would have to be pretty strong, and there is no way that a woman or a kid could have done this. Defebaugh keeps looking, and he finds a fingerprint in the utility room. A further search of the house, particularly the bathroom, reveals, pardon the expression, another bloodbath. Blood on the rug, the bathtub, the walls. It appears that the perpetrator attempted to clean up in the bathroom, but got overwhelmed and left more of a mess, frankly. I mean, the house looks like Camp Crystal Lake because remember, it's Friday the 13th, and if you know, you know, but it is just an absolute massacre. There's no evidence of a burglary, no evidence of a break-in, so investigators are stumped about what the hell has happened in this quiet little house on this quiet little street in quiet little Wiley, Texas. Or as Jim Atkinson said in People Magazine Investigates, quote, "You have a bloodbath that looks like Manson." And lending credence to this theory, on the kitchen table, there is a copy of that day's Dallas Morning News, open to the movie section, which, gosh, remember looking in the newspaper for movie showtimes? Sorry, sidetracked. Gen X. At any rate, there is an ad for the movie The Shining, which had opened that day and features an axe-wielding Jack Nicholson terrorizing his family. The brutality of Betty's murder obviously puts the entire town on edge, as people start locking their doors, keeping their blinds closed, and speculating that there is a crazed killer on the loose. Betty didn't have any enemies, so who would do this? And why? Betty's family comes to Wiley from Norwich, and when they see Alan, that's Betty's husband, he seems distant to them, off. Or as Jim Atkinson says in People magazine investigates, quote, he does not strike them as being appropriately grieving. Pat Pomeroy, that's Betty's sister-in-law, elaborated that, quote, you just didn't see the emotion that you expect. So meanwhile, police turn their attention to building a timeline of Betty's final day, and they follow up on something that Alan has told him, which is that Candy Montgomery had actually dropped by the house the morning of the murder to pick up a bathing suit for his daughter, Alyssa, who, remember, was staying the night at the Montgomery house. Candy says she came to the house around 10 that morning to pick up the suit, played for a little while with the two dogs that the Gores had just gotten, and that she and Betty chatted for a hot minute, and that she went on about her day. Candy says that Betty was fine, everything was fine, and that was that. Since she had been at the house that day, police wanted her fingerprints, which Candy gave, and police turned their attention to other matters. Specifically, Betty's autopsy report. The acting coroner, John Buddy Newton, who oddly was also the justice of the peace, small towns, he gave an interview to local media where he pulled no punches about just how much Betty had suffered, saying, quote, imagine whatever you think to be the very worst possible thing you could see in the middle of the night, and then multiply it by about 6, and then maybe you'd have it. It turns out that Betty was hit with that axe 41 times. 41 times. And 28 of those blows were to her head. I don't know, John Buddy Newton, I'd say multiply about 100 because holy hell. It's overkill. It's total overkill. So because it's overkill, that leads police to a couple of conclusions. 1, that the murder was personal. Yeah, I'd say so. 2, that Betty knew her killer. And 3, it was likely fueled by jealousy of some kind of anger. Well, that can only point to one person, right? The acting strangely husband, Alan. And so investigators turn their eyes toward him and bring him in for formal questioning. Now, Alan has a pretty solid alibi as he was in Minneapolis, St. Paul on a business trip, and he has all of the receipts to back this up. He does tell investigators that Betty hated him traveling all the time for work because essentially she's a married single mother. To boot, since the birth of their youngest daughter, Betty has been dealing with pretty severe postpartum depression. As if that's not enough, Betty is sure that she is pregnant again, which she's a little freaked out by. But I should note that the medical examiner determined she was not pregnant at the time of her murder. But back to Alan's alibi. Although he's got all the receipts, it is not out of the realm of possibility that he could have murdered Betty, then got on a plane for Minneapolis like nothing happened. His daughter Alyssa was staying at the Montgomerys, but, and this is a big but, is Alan heartless enough to leave his baby daughter alone and screaming for hours? Also, remember, he was pretty frantic that he hadn't been able to reach Betty all day, which, okay, you could say he's trying to cover his tracks, but Alan as a culprit, despite his completely disconnected affect, it's not jibing. It's not giving. It's just not giving. Investigators ask Alan if there were any infidelities in his marriage to Betty, and he says no. He is then asked to come back to the station the next day for a polygraph or lie detector test. So all of this is pretty standard. Well, after a night's sleep, the next morning, Alan calls and says, yeah, you know how you asked me if I'd had an affair and I said no? Well, about that. I lied because I did have an affair with Candy Montgomery. Next week on part 2, the details of Candy and Alan's affair come out, and investigators think it's a pretty clear motive for Betty's murder. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of The Dark Side of Love. I'm your host, Bianca Sloan, and show your love for The Dark Side of Love by visiting thedarksideoflove.com for show notes and transcripts. While you're there, sign up for my newsletter to be notified about new episodes. You can also find a link to my Patreon page where you can access bonus material and other fun stuff. Learn more about my suspense novels about the dark side of love by visiting biancasloan.com. Thanks for hanging out with me, and join me next time for another tale of love gone wrong. I'll see you on the dark side.